As Israel's atrocities in Gaza have become ever more clear, committed Zionists have been forced to dismiss an ever wider range of international institutions, as Mehdi Hasan found out at a recent debate.
I want you to also offer defense of international institutions at this moment as it relates to holding the state of Israel to account.
I have just one sentence to say about that, is that the entire world wants a ceasefire, and the United States and Israel and, I don't know, the Micronesia and whatever else don't, right? The entire world takes a very different view, unfortunately, to the people in this room and to Douglas and Natasha. The International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the UNHCR, UNICEF, Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, Christian Aid. Yep, you're booing. What does it come to when you're booing Oxfam? What does that tell you about yourselves? You're sitting here booing Oxfam to defend Benjamin Netanyahu. Let me just deal with something you just said. You talked about debunking propaganda. First of all, you can't even get Israeli propaganda straight. The Israeli government's own security agency, Shin Bet, investigated what you just said and said, no, we found no evidence that workers from Gaza were involved in the October 7th attack. Oh, Shin Bet alive. They're booing Shin Bet, the Israeli security service. Got it.
So they did a poll sort of at the beginning of that debate asking sort of who the audience were, what they thought. The debate was about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And it's very clear that the majority of the audience were Zionists. And this is something I think we've come to see over and over again since October the 7th, which is the moment an institution criticizes Israel or sort of says what it's doing in Gaza is horrific and many innocent people are dying and they're struggling to get food in there, people try and sort of delegitimize the institution. And, you know, I don't think that's a completely unreasonable strategy in general. Whenever I hear a claim, right, I want to know, okay, who's making the claim? What are their interests? What are the methods? But I think the point that Mehdi Hasan made well there is that when you've got this list of institutions, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, you've got the UNHCR, so the UN Human Rights Commission, and you've got Oxfam, you've got all of these human rights organizations, all of these aid organizations, right? These are people who, you know, their organizations are generally sort of committed to trying to keep people alive. And if you think there's a conspiracy among all of them to make up that there's a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza when really there isn't, it's come to something. Of course, at the end, sort of the cherry on the cake was that he was saying that Shin Bet, clearly another person on the panel, had sort of pointed out or made the claim that people who had work permits in Israel had been part of October the 7th. He says even Shin Bet, which is an Israeli security force, has debunked that, and everyone boos. He's like, you won't even believe Israel's own security forces. It's just this see no evil, hear no evil sort of attitude, I suppose. As I say, Mehdi Hasan was speaking. It was a monk debate in Canada. The motion under contention was whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And Hasan was up against some very committed defenders of Israel, including the right-wing pundit Douglas Murray.
There is no reason why a Jewish state should not be able to live side by side with another Arab-Palestinian state. Okay? The only, and I'm glad that Gideon brought up Oslo, the only reason that there is not a Palestinian state today, not the Palestinian Authority, which runs most of the West Bank, or Hamas, that was given the Gaza and then decided to do, well, we know what they decided to do with 18 years of international funding from this country and others. Not that, but if they were given another state, there is no reason, if they brought their children up to love life and to live by their neighbors, if they educated their children into learning instead of hate, there is no reason why they could not live in a state beside a Jewish state. And there's no reason why Zionism opposes that, and it doesn't.
It's kind of scary to see that get a big round of applause. You know, the idea that Palestinian parents don't bring up their children to love life, right? They've brought up their children to be inherently hateful people. And that's why this genocidal war against them is essentially justified. I mean, that seems to be what Douglas Murray is suggesting, right? He denies the genocidal war, of course. But the idea that the only reason there hasn't been peace in the Middle East is not because the Israelis have a stated aim of settling the entirety of Greater Israel. Like, that's literally what the Prime Minister of Israel says he wants when he holds up maps at the UN, which says Israel and it's all the territory, including Palestine, right? No, he's completely blind to that. Oh, no, Israel really want a two-state solution. The only problem is that the Palestinians raise their kids to hate life. It's so, you know, you can call it racist or hate-filled. It's also just incredibly implausible, right? It's just not a persuasive argument, but it still gets a round of applause there. As I say, it was a sort of predominantly Zionist audience that they were speaking to. Murray was debating alongside Natasha Hausdorff. She's from Lawyers for Israel. And she said this.
I have to begin with a debating tip coming from a land with a culture of a rich history of debate. And that is that in debates, it is for the proposition to define the motion. And Douglas did that for you, loud and clear. Mehdi seems to think that he can redefine anti-Zionism without you noticing, but the proposition are not going to allow him to pull the wool over your eyes and conflate Zionism with politics. Who has the right to define Zionism? Well, apart from the proposition in this debate, because that's how the rules work. Would you ask a misogynist to define misogyny? You wouldn't ask a sex offender to define rape. You wouldn't ask the KKK to define anti-black racism. So why, when it comes to the Jews, would you let the anti-Zionists define anti-Zionism? No, ladies and gentlemen, no minority should have its identity dictated to it.
That's a very strange argument for a lawyer to make, right? Because the question she actually said, I don't know if she was misspeaking, but she said, who gets to define Zionism? That's what she said. Who gets to define Zionism? Then she says, misogynists don't get to define misogyny. Racists don't get to define racism. And Zionists don't get to define, oh, shit, that doesn't actually work. Zionists don't get to define Zionism. Ah! Right. Of course, personally, I don't think any group should get a monopoly on defining anything, right? I think it's sort of silly to say, oh, only the victims of something should be able to define what they're experiencing. I think that's a route to sort of a complete impasse, because it means that you can't have rational argument about anything. However, if there is any logic to this kind of politics, it's that when defining a political project or a form of oppression, we should pay particular attention to its victims. And I do think this is reasonable. For example, when defining sexism, women shouldn't have a monopoly on any discussion. We should be able to have rational debate regardless on who is the person speaking. But it would make sense to pay special attention to the views of women. Similar when defining anti-Semitism, right? Jews shouldn't have a monopoly on any discussion or definition, but we should, of course, pay special attention to Jews. And what does that mean for defining Zionism? Well, if we're paying special attention to the victims of a political project or movement, that would surely be the Palestinians. Now, unfortunately, there weren't any Palestinians on that panel, but the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy spoke with some real passion on how Palestinians grow up to think about Zionism.
Each of you ask yourself, if you would have been born Palestinian and live all your life under the brutal, maybe the most brutal regime today in the world. I saw it. When you would wake up in the morning and see your parents beaten and go to sleep at night and troops will come to your home and kidnap your father or your mother in front of your eyes on a daily basis, and I know what I'm talking about. Don't tell me about facts, yeah? What do you think you would have felt toward the people who does it to you? What do you think? It has nothing to do with education system. They don't need education system to hate us. Okay, we make them hating us.
It's a really, really strong, powerful response to basically what Douglas Murray was saying, right? They raise their kids to hate life. No, their kids grow up in a situation where they're denied basic rights by a neighboring country, where the only time they see Israelis is when there's sort of security people pointing guns at them or kicking them out of their homes, right? You don't have to teach people like that to hate Israel. They're going to learn that from their experience of having guns pointed at them and their homes knocked down. Ash, I mean, people watching that might think that seemed like a quite strange environment. You sort of had this big braying audience, these four big names debating. They're booing anytime anyone says something critical of Israel. I know you've done a monk debate, haven't you? You've been in those chairs. Your one was about liberalism, I think. What was your sense watching what was going on there?
Well, my debate was a lot less rowdy. So it was about liberalism. I was debating Jacob Rees-Mogg and George F. Will, and we ended up winning the debate because we swayed a bigger chunk of the audience. I feel very proud of that. But it was a much less challenging environment generally, because quite clearly you had an audience which was very supportive of Zionism and intensely hostile towards any criticism of the actually existing state of Israel. And that makes it very difficult to make points which are going to be heard by somebody else, because effectively you've got someone who has hermetically sealed themselves within an alternative information universe, and you're sort of knocking on the door and saying, well, no, this is some other information, that they're not going to hear it because their entire worldview is dependent on them not hearing it. Listening to the contributions of the lady from Lawyers for Israel and also Douglas Murray, it is astonishing to me how intellectually dishonest contemporary Zionists are compared to the originators of the Zionist movement. So, not that long ago, I read an essay which was written by one of the early Zionists called, I can't, I'm going to be absolutely butchering the pronunciation, so very, very sorry. I think it's Zev Jabotinsky. And Jabotinsky wrote an essay called The Iron Wall. And what he said is this, and he said, write this as a Zionist, as an ardent, militant Zionist. Basically, the point of the Iron Wall was, if you think that there's a vegetarian option for Zionism, dream on. There is one way that a Jewish majority state is going to be established in an Arab majority territory, and that's going to be through use of violence. We have to militarize this Zionist state. We have to build an iron wall. There will be violent resistance to it because that's natural. It is in the nature of anyone who is being colonized to resist colonial settlers. This is what he writes in The Iron Wall. The difference between me and Jabotinsky is that he assigns a very different moral value to the act of that militarization, the act of establishing a Zionist state on top of an Arab majority territory by force. He says, well, I think that's a morally justified thing to do, but either way you look at it, it's going to take violence, there's going to be resistance, and it's perfectly natural for there to be resistance. It's not because they hate us, it's not because we're Jews, it's because we're taking land and resources from them. Similarly, Theodor Herzl, again, one of the original Zionists, described the project as a settler colonial project. Now, that is miles away from how Zionists present the project of the State of Israel and what Israel's doing. And instead, it's all about kind of transferring what is a deeply European phenomenon, which is anti-Semitism, and making that a Palestinian issue and saying, well, look, these people are motivated by an ideological and religious hatred for the Jews. That's why they resist the state of Israel. That's why you have an organization like Hamas. Now, I'm not saying that Hamas isn't anti-Semitic, but to say that the causal factor here is anti-Semitism is a complete and utter sham. The causal factor is that Palestinians have been robbed, that they have been brutalized, that they have been ethnically cleansed, that they have been subject to massacres.